The trauma doors blew open at 12:04 a.m., and the man they dragged in was already half gone. His chest looked like something had tried to take it apart from the inside, blood everywhere. A wound that made the paramedics' hands shake as they rattled off vitals that were getting worse by the second. Every doctor on the floor locked onto that chest wound like it was the only thing in the room. Every doctor except one nurse standing near the wall who wasn't looking at the wound at all. She was looking at a scar, old, faded, surgically precise, hidden under the blood on his left side. And in the 3 seconds it took her to see it, she already knew what was killing him. And it wasn't what anyone else in that room thought it was. If you're watching this right now, stay with me until the end. Like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The night had been unremarkable right up until it wasn't. Maren Briggs had worked the overnight shift at Callaway Ridge Medical Center for going on 6 years, and she'd learned early that quiet nights in a hospital were a kind of lie. The calm that existed only until something ripped through it. She'd learned not to trust the quiet, not because she was pessimistic, but because she was realistic. She'd been in places where the quiet before something broke was the loudest sound in the world. Tonight she was restocking the supply cart near Trauma Bay 2 when the radio crackled at the nurse's station. She caught fragments: MVA, multi-trauma, male, mid-30s, BP dropping, and straightened without thinking, the muscle memory of a different life briefly surfacing before she pressed it back down. She wasn't that person here. Here she was, Nurse Briggs, night shift, Callaway Ridge, Dunmore Falls, Wyoming. She handed off the supply manifest to one of the newer nurses, told her to finish it, and moved toward the bay with the steady walk she'd cultivated over years of forcing herself not to run. The paramedics came through the doors at 12:04 a.m., moving fast. The patient was a large man, broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that took years of serious physical conditioning to maintain. He was unconscious, shirt cut away, and what was immediately visible was the chest wound, a jagged laceration running from his right collarbone toward his sternum, deep enough that Maren could see it pulsing with each weak heartbeat. Blood had pooled under him on the gurney, soaked through the pressure dressing the medics had applied, and was still coming. Blunt force chest trauma, possible pneumothorax, BP's 68/40, and still falling. The lead paramedic was talking fast, barely keeping up with herself. No ID on him, found at the scene of a single vehicle rollover out on Route 9. No passengers, no witnesses. Airbag deployed. We think he hit the steering column. Dr. Callum Dreer was already moving. He was the attending on call, a tall man with silver-touched hair and the kind of practiced authority that filled a room before he opened his mouth. Maren had worked under him for 3 of her 6 years here, and she respected his competence. Within limits, she'd quietly cataloged over time. Let's get him on the table. Chest X-ray, fast exam, 2 large-bore IVs. Get me a type and cross, CBC, BMP, coags. He snapped on gloves and leaned over the patient, his eyes on the wound. That laceration's going to need surgical attention. Is cardiothoracic on call? Dr. Fenwick is in the building, someone called from the back. Good. Get her down here. Maren was at the patient's left side, helping transfer him from the gurney to the trauma table when she saw it. She almost missed it. The overhead light hit at a specific angle for maybe 2 seconds as the team repositioned him. And in those 2 seconds, she saw the scar on his left lateral abdomen, 3 inches long, clean-edged, the specific curved shape of a surgical approach she recognized. It wasn't from this accident. It was old. Healed years ago, probably. But the location and the shape told her something specific, something that snagged hard in her memory. She looked at the monitors. BP was 64/38 now. Heart rate 118 and climbing. She looked at the chest wound. Still bad. Still needed attention. But a pneumothorax from blunt impact would be presenting differently. She'd be hearing absent breath sounds, seeing tracheal deviation. She leaned in without making it obvious and listened to his chest as the team worked around her. Breath sounds were present bilaterally, diminished on the right, but present. She looked at the scar again. Then she looked at the ultrasound machine sitting in the corner. Dr. Dreyer, she kept her voice even. I want to run a quick fast exam before we focus on the chest. Dreyer didn't look up from the wound. Ultrasound team is on their way down. Step back, Nurse Briggs, and let us work. His breath sounds are present bilaterally. The chest wound is significant, but I don't think it's the primary bleed. His BP drop is out of proportion to what we're seeing externally. I think we need to look at his abdomen. That got Dreyer's attention, but not the kind she wanted. He glanced at her over the patient's chest with an expression that managed to communicate both impatience and condescension in a single look. I appreciate the input. The abdomen is on the list. Right now we're managing the presenting injury. The presenting injury might not be what's killing him. Nurse Briggs. His voice dropped a degree in temperature. I have this. She stepped back. Not because she agreed with him, because arguing in the middle of a trauma bay while the team was trying to work wasn't going to save this man faster. She stepped back and she thought, and she looked at that monitor, and she watched the numbers keep sliding in the wrong direction. The respiratory tech arrived and started the chest x-ray. Maren moved to the ultrasound machine and powered it on, quietly, while everyone else's eyes were on the chest. She wasn't technically authorized to run a diagnostic fast exam unilaterally. That was physician territory. But she'd been trained on the equipment and she knew how to hold a probe. She had the probe in her hand and was positioning it near the patient's right upper quadrant before anyone noticed what she was doing. What she saw on the screen made her chest go cold. Free fluid, a significant collection in the hepatorenal space, Morrison's pouch, pooling in a way that meant one thing clearly. This man was bleeding into his abdomen, probably had been for a while, and the volume was enough to explain every number on that monitor. Dr. Dreyer. Her voice came out sharper this time. She turned the screen. Look at this. He looked. His jaw tightened. She watched him process it, watched the small recalibration happen behind his eyes, even as his expression stayed professionally flat. Get CT. There's no time for CT. His pressure just hit 58. She was already looking at the resident standing nearest to her. He needs the OR. Now. I will make that determination, Dreyer said, and his voice had gone very quiet, which was somehow worse than when doctors raised theirs. You are a nurse, Ms. Briggs. Step back and let the physicians manage this. The monitor alarm fired. Heart rate 132. BP 5430. He's crashing, someone said, unnecessarily. What happened in the next 90 seconds was something Maren would think about later in the specific fragmented way that high-stress moments embedded themselves, not as a smooth narrative, but as a series of compressed impressions. She remembered Dreyer moving toward the chest wound with intent, calling for a chest tube tray, still focused on the presenting injury. She remembered the resident, a young woman named Dr. Falk, 3 months into her second year, looking between Maren and the ultrasound screen with the particular expression of someone who knew something was wrong but wasn't yet senior enough to say so. She remembered the patient's color, which had gone past pale into something that looked like paper under fluorescent light. She remembered making a decision, not a dramatic one, not the kind of decision that announces itself, just a quiet shift from standing at the edge to stepping forward. I need a surgeon. I need the OR cleared. I need someone to call Dr. Fenwick right now and tell her we have a splenic lac or a hepatic bleed, uncontained, and we are out of time. She was already at the phone on the wall. She picked it up. This is Nurse Briggs in Trauma 2. I need Dr. Fenwick on the line immediately. Yes, I know she's in the building. Tell her it's urgent. Tell her we have a grade 4 or 5 abdominal bleed and the attending is focused on the wrong injury. The silence behind her was the kind that presses. Dreyer turned around slowly. Put that phone down. She stays on the line, Maren said, not turning around. Into the phone. Dr. Fenwick. Patient in Trauma Bay 2, male, approximately mid-30s, rollover MVA. BP is in the 50s. Fast shows free fluid in Morrison's pouch, significant volume. Breath sounds present bilaterally. Chest wound is a surface injury. He needs exploratory lap, not a chest tube. She heard a voice through the receiver. Clipped, alert, already moving. I'm coming down. 2 minutes. She hung up and turned to face Dreyer. He was very still. The controlled stillness of a man deciding which kind of angry to be. You just went over my head, he said. In my trauma bay. In front of my team. In front of your team? Yes. She met his eyes. Your patient is going to die in approximately 4 minutes if someone doesn't get him to an OR. I'm sorry if I stepped on protocol. I'll answer for it later. The monitor alarm changed pitch, and 2 things happened simultaneously. Dr. Elaine Fenwick pushed through the trauma bay doors still pulling on a glove, and the patient's blood pressure disappeared from the screen entirely as he went into PEA arrest. What followed was controlled chaos in the way that only a good trauma team can manage. Which is to say, it wasn't controlled at all. It was fast and loud, and everyone was making decisions in fractions of seconds. Marin fell into the rhythm of it without thinking. Chest compressions. Epinephrine. Someone pushed a crash cart in from the hallway. Doctor. Fenwick took one look at the ultrasound screen, one look at the patient, and said, "Get him upstairs. We're not fixing this down here." They had him back. Weak pulse, pressure, somewhere north of 60, within 4 minutes. They were moving toward the elevator at 5. Marin stood in the trauma bay and watched them go. The room was quieter now. The resident, Dr. Falk, was still standing near the ultrasound machine, looking at Marin with an expression that was hard to read, something between relief and worry. "You know he's going to file a report," Falk said quietly. "I know. Is there documentation of what you saw?" Marin looked at the ultrasound machine. The timestamp on the last saved image was 12:11 a.m. The image was still on the screen, but free fluid. Morrison's pouch. Clear as anything. She looked at Falk. "Take a picture of that screen. Right now." Falk hesitated, then pulled out her phone and took it. Marin didn't know what was coming, but she knew what she'd done, and she knew why. And she knew that the image on that screen existed inside the hospital's own system with a timestamp that told a story Dreer couldn't rewrite. The surgery took 4 hours. Marin spent most of them at her station, finishing documentation, checking on the 2 other patients she was responsible for overnight, and drinking coffee that was terrible, and that she drank anyway because it gave her hands something to do. The hospital had a specific kind of quiet after a trauma. Not peaceful, just temporarily emptied out, the rooms and hallways still holding the residue of urgency. Nobody came to talk to her. The nurses on shift were careful about eye contact, the way people get when they know something happened and aren't sure which side to be on. Around 3 a.m., one of the surgical nurses, a woman named Petra, who Marin had worked alongside for 4 years, stopped by the station with a look on her face that communicated more than she said out loud. "He's out of surgery. Dr. Fenwick closed a grade 4 splenic lac and a hepatic vein tear. She said another 10 minutes, and he probably didn't survive it." Marin nodded. "Good. You doing okay?" "I'm fine." Petra looked at her for a moment. "Dreer's upstairs. He's been on the phone." "I figured." "Marin," Petra lowered her voice, "what you did was the right thing." She said it simply, without the defensiveness it might have needed in a different mouth. "I know that's not the same as what's going to happen next, but it was the right thing." Petra didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. At 4:17 a.m., the nursing supervisor, a man named Gerald Oakes, who Marin had always found competent if not warm, appeared at the station with a clipboard and an expression that meant paperwork of a specific kind. "Briggs, I need you to come with me." She came. His office was small and fluorescent and smelled like old coffee, the universal smell of hospital administration everywhere. He sat across from her and put the clipboard on the desk, and didn't quite meet her eyes at first, which told her the conversation had already been decided before she walked in. "Dr. Dreer has filed a formal complaint," he said. "He's alleging that you performed an unauthorized diagnostic procedure, interfered with his management of an active trauma, and circumvented the chain of command in a way that could have disrupted the resuscitation effort. The patient is alive." "That's noted." Oakes's voice was careful. Professionally careful. The kind of careful that kept a person employable in hospital administration for decades. But the allegation is about protocol, not outcome. "I used the ultrasound to perform a bedside assessment consistent with my training and scope. I communicated my findings to the attending. When the attending declined to act on findings that I assessed as immediately life-threatening, I escalated to a specialist who was in the building and reachable." "You called a specialist over the attending's explicit objection." "Yes." He wrote something. She watched his pen move and thought about what it meant that people in his position always wrote things down at moments like this, as if the act of writing created distance between them and the decision. "The hospital is going to need to review this formally," he said. "In the meantime, I have to ask you to take administrative leave while we complete the process. With pay," he added, as if that changed the shape of it. "You're suspending me. I'm placing you on administrative leave pending review. The language matters." Marin looked at him for a moment. The man who came in tonight is alive because someone looked at the right evidence at the right time. That's documented. The image from the ultrasound is time-stamped and in the system. Every action I took is on record. When the review happens, the record is going to be very clear. That may be the case, but procedure requires— I know what procedure requires. She stood. I've been a nurse for a long time, Mr. Oakes. I know what this is. She walked back to her station, gathered her things, and clocked out at 4:31 a.m. The parking lot of Callaway Ridge Medical Center was empty at that hour, lit by high halogen poles that made the Wyoming darkness beyond the lot look even darker by contrast. Marin sat in her truck for a minute before starting the engine, not thinking about what had happened so much as sitting with the particular weight of having done the right thing and knowing that doing the right thing didn't protect you from what came next. She'd known that for a long time. She'd learned it in a different context, on a different kind of ground. She started the truck and drove. The town of Dunmore Falls existed in one of those pockets of the Mountain West that people drive through without stopping. A main street with a hardware store, a diner that had been there since the 1970s, a few hundred houses arranged around a high school whose parking lot was the largest flat surface in the area. The medical center was the biggest employer in the county, which was part of why what happened inside it mattered to everyone in it in ways that went beyond medical care. Marin's house was a rental, a two-bedroom frame house at the edge of town with a spruce tree in the backyard that had grown too big for the yard and shaded the whole back half of the property. She'd lived there for 4 years. She had a couch and a good kitchen and a box in the closet that she'd moved 4 times without opening. She made eggs. She drank real coffee. She sat at her kitchen table in the 5 a.m. dark and felt the shape of the situation. She would not be allowed back in the hospital while the review ran. She knew from watching other nurses go through similar processes that reviews of this kind took whatever time the administration needed them to take, which was usually as long as the person filing the complaint needed to feel that the weight had been distributed in a direction that suited them. Dreer had been at Callaway Ridge for 11 years. He had a parking spot with his name on it and his photograph on the wall in the lobby and a reputation that the hospital's fundraising materials cited specifically. She had a time-stamped ultrasound image and the testimony of a second-year resident who would have to decide what mattered more to her career, what she'd seen, or the opinion of the man who would eventually write her evaluations. It was not a comfortable position. What Marin did not know yet, what she could not have known, sitting in her kitchen watching the spruce tree emerge slowly from the darkness as morning came, was that the man on the table upstairs was not what anyone thought he was, that the rollover on Route 9 was not entirely an accident, that the lack of ID on him was not an oversight, and that sometime in the next 36 hours, people were going to start arriving in Dunmore Falls who would change the shape of everything. Well, she slept badly for a few hours and woke up to her phone going. It was Dr. Falk. The resident's voice was pitched low, like she was calling from somewhere she didn't want to be overheard. "He's awake." Marin sat up. "Already?" "Just barely. He's in the ICU and he's not supposed to have visitors, but he's—" A pause. "He's asking for someone. He doesn't know any of our names. He's asking for the nurse, the one in the trauma bay." Marin was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't know my name. He's described you. Height, hair, the fact that you were on his left side. He's very specific." Another pause. "He seems— I don't know how to say this without it sounding strange. He seems like he's used to being in bad situations. He's calm in a way that patients who just came out of 4 hours of abdominal surgery usually aren't." Marin thought about the scar, the specific surgical scar on his left side that had started all of this. "I'm on administrative leave," she said. "I can't come in." "I know. I just thought you should know." Falk hesitated. "There's something else. 2 men showed up this morning asking about him. Not family. They said they were colleagues, but they didn't have hospital visitor clearance, and they didn't have any identification the front desk found convincing. Security turned them away." "What did they look like?" "Big. Both of them. The way certain people are big, like it's functional, not incidental." Marin didn't say anything for a moment. "Thanks for calling me," she said finally. "He's asking for you," Falk said. "I thought you should know what you walked into last night." The call ended and Marin sat on the edge of her bed with the phone in her hand and looked at the box in the closet that she hadn't opened in 4 years. She didn't open it now either. She got dressed, made more coffee, and stood at her kitchen window watching a morning in Dunmore Falls that looked exactly like every other morning in Dunmore Falls. The spruce tree moving a little in the wind, the neighbor's dog making its regular circuit of the fence line, the particular pale gold of early light on Wyoming dust. But she was thinking about a scar, about what kind of surgery left a scar that shape in that location, about a man who woke up from anesthesia asking for the nurse on his left side by description instead of by name, about two men without credentials who showed up before the patient was even fully conscious. She was thinking about the kind of situations where people arrived without identification in a specific kind of condition, and then other people came looking for them before the blood was cold. She'd been out of that world for 6 years. She'd chosen Dunmore Falls specifically because it was the opposite of that world, quiet, predictable, grounded in the ordinary mechanics of keeping people well in a small town. Whatever had come through those trauma doors last night, it wasn't ordinary. She'd known that from the first moment she saw the scar. She'd focused on saving his life because that was the job, and it was the job she chose to do, and she was good at it. But now he was awake, and he was asking for her, and there were men showing up who didn't belong in this hospital, and the attending who should have caught what she caught was using an ethics complaint to ensure the conversation stayed focused on her conduct rather than his. And somewhere in the hospital's system, time stamped at 12:11 a.m., was an ultrasound image that told a story more clearly than anyone upstairs currently wanted to acknowledge. She rinsed her coffee cup. She thought about what Petra had said. Dreer's been on the phone. She thought about what Falk had said. He seems like he's used to being in bad situations. Then she thought about what she'd said to Gerald Oakes, quietly, in that office smelling of old coffee. When the review happens, the record is going to be very clear. She believed that. She had to. But she also knew, from experience she'd spent 6 years quietly setting aside, that the record being clear wasn't always the same thing as the record being used. That truth had a shelf life in institutions, and the institutions that most needed truth to matter were often the least equipped to let it. She dried her hands and looked at the clock. 7:42 a.m. Whatever was going to happen next was already in motion, in the ICU on the 3rd floor of Callaway Ridge Medical Center, in the phone calls Dreher was making, in the questions a barely conscious man was asking with a specific kind of calm that Marin recognized from a version of her own life she hadn't looked at directly in years. She looked out the window at the spruce tree. Somewhere in this quiet, ordinary town, the clock had started on something that wasn't quiet and wasn't ordinary at all. And the woman standing at the kitchen window in a rental house at the edge of Dunmore Falls was the only person in it who understood exactly what was at stake. She just didn't know yet how many people were about to find that out. She didn't go to the hospital. That was the decision she made standing at the kitchen window, and she held it through the morning with the particular discipline of someone who understood that walking back into a situation before you had solid ground under your feet was how people got swallowed by it. She was on administrative leave. Showing up at Callaway Ridge uninvited, going to the ICU to see a patient she wasn't authorized to visit, in a unit she wasn't cleared to enter while under review, would hand Dreher exactly the kind of additional ammunition he was probably hoping she'd give him. So she stayed home. She cleaned things that didn't need cleaning. She went through her documentation from the night before a second time in her head, testing it for gaps, finding none. She called no one. She waited. Around 11 in the morning, her phone rang with an unknown number, and she answered it because she'd been answering unknown numbers since she was 24 years old, and certain calls couldn't wait for callbacks. The voice on the other end was a man's, low and measured, with the specific economy of someone who said exactly what they meant and nothing more. Ms. Briggs, my name is Aldrich Novak. I work with a federal interagency task force operating out of the Mountain West region. I understand you were the nurse on duty when our operative was brought into Callaway Ridge last night. She was quiet for 2 seconds. I'm on administrative leave. I know. That's actually part of why I'm calling. A brief pause. I'd like to meet with you. Not at the hospital. Somewhere neutral. What's the operative's name? Another pause. Shorter. A recalibration of how much to give. Soren Maddock. She didn't recognize the name. She hadn't expected to. Is he going to be all right? The surgical team says he's stable. Dr. Fenwick is managing his care. A beat. She's been very clear that his survival last night was a close thing. She mentioned the FAST exam findings and the timeline. Marin didn't say anything to that. I think it would be worth your time, Novak said. The diner on Kettle Street. Noon, if that works. She thought about it for 3 seconds. I'll be there. The diner was called Harmon's, and it had been on Kettle Street since before Marin was born. It smelled like hash browns and old wood, and the particular combination of fryer oil and industrial coffee that was the same in every diner in every small town in America. She arrived 4 minutes early and took a booth in the back with a sightline to the door, which was habit and nothing she thought about consciously anymore. Novak arrived exactly at noon. He was shorter than his voice suggested, maybe 5'10", compact, wearing civilian clothes that fit him in the slightly too functional way that suggested he chose them for ease of movement rather than appearance. He had the kind of face that didn't volunteer information. He slid into the booth across from her and ordered coffee from the server without looking at the menu. "You're not going to show me credentials," Marin said. It wasn't a question. "I can." He reached into his jacket. "Don't bother. If you're federal and you wanted to have this conversation in an official capacity, we'd be somewhere official." She put her hands around her mug. "What do you actually want?" He looked at her for a moment. Whatever he was assessing, he seemed to reach a conclusion. Soren Maddock was on an operation. I'm not going to tell you what kind because it doesn't affect what I need to tell you, but the short version is that his vehicle going off Route 9 was not an accident. Someone ran him off the road. Who? That's what we're trying to determine. He wrapped his hands around his own mug. What I can tell you is that he was carrying information, nothing physical, it's in his head, that a number of people would prefer stayed there permanently. And 2 of those people showed up at Callaway Ridge this morning. Security turned them away. This time. He said it flatly. The hospital's security infrastructure is not designed for what we're dealing with. We've been in contact with hospital administration, but the situation is complicated by the fact that Maddox's identity and mission status are classified, which limits what we can say to civilian facilities without triggering a disclosure process that takes longer than we have. Marin thought about that. You need him moved. We need him stable enough to move. Dr. Fenwick says that's a minimum of 48 hours, probably 72. He met her eyes. In the meantime, we have 2 people on the floor in civilian capacity. But if something goes wrong medically, we need someone who knows his case, someone who was there last night and understands what happened to him. I'm suspended. I know, that situation. He paused. I've been in contact with some people. The complaint against you is going to run into some friction. What kind of friction? The kind that comes from federal interest in the medical records of an injured government operative and the question of whether protocol was followed correctly in his care. He said it carefully, like he was placing each word. Dr. Dreher's conduct last night is going to receive scrutiny that has nothing to do with your complaint and everything to do with how a federal asset came within minutes of dying on his table. Marin looked at him. She looked at him for long enough that most people would have felt the weight of it, and Novak just looked back, which was another thing that told her something about who he was. That's not why I did what I did, she said. I know. He sounded like he meant it. I'm not suggesting it was. I'm telling you what's going to happen regardless of your involvement going forward. What I'm asking is whether you're willing to be available, informally, in a civilian capacity, while Maddock is in that hospital. She thought about the 2 men who'd shown up that morning, the way Falk had described them, the way certain people are big, like it's functional, not incidental. She thought about Soren Maddock asking for the nurse on his left side by description rather than by name, because he didn't have her name, but he remembered where she'd been standing. What's his condition right now? She asked. Specifically. Novak pulled out his phone and found something, turned it toward her. It was a brief clinical summary. Vitals. The surgical notes from Fenwick, current ICU status. She read it in under a minute. His post-op hemoglobin is lower than I'd like, she said. Fenwick said the same thing. He needs to be watched for re-bleed. Grade 4 splenic lac repairs can decompensate fast, especially if there was any missed injury during the initial surgery, and 4 hours of abdominal exploration under emergency conditions doesn't guarantee you caught everything. She said that too. He put the phone away. Almost word for word. Marin set down her mug. She thought about her kitchen, about the box in the closet, about 6 years of choosing ordinary on purpose. I'm not going back to that, she said. Whatever you're thinking I am or was, I'm a nurse. That's what I do now. I'm not asking you to be anything else. His voice was even. I'm asking you to be a nurse for a patient who needs one, in a situation that's more complicated than usual. That's all. She looked at the table for a moment, then she looked up. I want access to his chart. Full access, not summary notes. I'll arrange it. And if I see something wrong in his care, I talk to Fenwick directly. Not through you, not filtered through anyone else. Directly. Agreed. And whatever friction you're applying to the Dreyer situation, that doesn't come near me. I don't want my suspension resolved through federal pressure. I want it resolved through the record. Novak was quiet for a beat. That might take longer. I know what it might take. She picked up her coffee. Those are my conditions. He nodded once. Okay. She was back at Callaway Ridge by 2 in the afternoon, not in scrubs, but in her own clothes, with a temporary access pass that Novak had arranged through channels she didn't ask about. The ICU charge nurse, a solid woman named Bet, who Marin had known for years, and who had the specific unflappability of someone who'd seen everything at least twice, looked at the pass, looked at Marin, and made a decision in about 2 seconds. He's in 4, Bet said. He's been awake on and off, doesn't talk much. Has anyone else tried to come up? Front desk flagged 2 attempts this morning, both turned away. Bet lowered her voice. There are 2 men in the waiting area on this floor who came in an hour ago. Said they were colleagues. I haven't let them pass the desk. A pause. They've been very polite about it. That's what's making me nervous. Marin understood that. Aggressive people made noise and drew attention. Polite, patient people who didn't leave were doing something else entirely. Keep them where they are, she said. If either of them moves toward the patient rooms, call security and then call me. Bet looked at her steadily. You want to tell me what's going on? Not yet. Maybe later. She held Bet's eyes. Trust me for a few hours. I've trusted you for 6 years, Bet said. Few more hours won't kill me. Marin went down the hall to room 4. What? Soren Matic looked worse awake than he had unconscious, which was sometimes how it went. Unconscious, the body was just a thing to be repaired. Awake, you could see how much the repair had cost. He was pale in the gray-toned way of significant blood loss, with IV lines in both arms and a monitor tracking vitals that were stable but not comfortable. His eyes were open when she pushed the door. They moved to her immediately. You're her, he said. His voice was rougher than she'd expected, but controlled. Left side of the table, you were the one who found it. Marin Briggs. She moved to the chair near his bed without asking permission. How are you feeling? Like someone opened my abdomen with a field knife, he paused. Which is apparently what happened, more or less. Surgical scalpel. Dr. Fenwick's very precise. She looked at his monitor. Your pressure's holding, that's good. You need to tell me immediately if you feel any abdominal pain that's new or increasing. Rebleed can happen fast with a grade 4 lac repair. He looked at her in the flat, assessing way that she recognized from people who spent a lot of time in situations where reading other people quickly was survival. Novak called you. He did. Did he tell you what happened? He told me enough. She pulled up his chart on the tablet Bet had given her access to and scanned it. He didn't tell me everything. He doesn't need to for what I'm here to do. Which is? Keep you alive until you're stable enough to be moved. She set the tablet down and looked at him directly. The 2 men in the waiting area. Do you know who sent them? Something moved through his expression. Not fear, but a kind of tightening, calculation. What do they look like? She relayed Bet's description. I was quiet for a moment. Don't let them near this room, he said. We're not planning to. She looked at the IV flow rate and adjusted it slightly. What's in your head that they want? He looked at the ceiling. Nothing that affects your job. It affects my security assessment of this floor, which does affect my job. She kept her voice clinical. I'm not asking for the details. I'm asking whether the people looking for you are the kind who would cause a scene in a public hospital or the kind who would wait. He thought about it. Wait. They'll wait. For how long? Until the calculation changes. He looked at her again. How long until I can be moved? Fenwick said 48 to 72 hours minimum. That's not negotiable. Your body needs that time whether you want to give it or not. He seemed to accept that with the resignation of someone used to his body being the limiting factor in operational timelines. Then we have 48 hours. We, she said. You're here, aren't you? She didn't answer that directly. She checked his surgical drain output, noted it in the chart, looked at the abdominal exam documentation from the morning. Everything was within acceptable range, which was the best you could say about the first day post-op from emergency abdominal surgery. Sleep if you can, she said, standing. Real sleep, not operational standby. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, quickly controlled. Is there a difference? In recovery, there is. She left him and went back to the nurse's station, and what she found there was Bet standing very still with a look on her face that meant something had changed. One of them moved, Bet said. The polite one, toward the south corridor. Myron looked at the hall. Empty. Where is he now? Security's walking him back to the waiting area. Bet paused. But Myron, he wasn't heading toward room 4. He was heading toward the records terminal at the end of the hall. What? That changed things. If they wanted Maddock dead, room 4 was the target, but the records terminal meant something else. It meant they wanted to know who else had been involved in his care, what had been documented, what trail existed. It meant they were thinking ahead in a way that was more dangerous than a direct approach. She found Novak's number and called it from the hall. Someone tried to access a records terminal on the ICU floor, she said, keeping her voice low. Your 2 men in the waiting area are not just waiting. A brief pause. How contained? So far. But this hospital does not have the infrastructure for this. You need more people here, or you need to find a way to move him faster than Fenwick's timeline. Working on both. Another pause. Are you all right? The question surprised her slightly, which surprised her further because it shouldn't have. I'm fine. Focus on the access problem. She hung up and went back to Bet. I need you to do something, Myron said. I need you to flag Maddox's chart so that any access attempt from a terminal outside this unit generates an alert. Can you do that through the system admin? I can put in the request. It might take an hour. Do it now. And if those 2 men ask to leave the waiting area for any reason, bathroom, vending machine, anything, they don't go alone. She looked at Bet steadily. I know this is a lot to ask. It's a lot, Bet agreed. But it's less than what you asked me to trust last week when you covered my entire Thursday shift on 2 hours' notice, so I think we're still even. She was already picking up the phone to call system admin. Marin went back down the hall. She stood outside room 4 for a moment, not going in. Through the narrow window in the door, she could see Maddock. His eyes were closed, which might have been sleep or might have been him listening to the corridor with the specific attention of someone trained to track his environment, even while horizontal. She thought about the records terminal, about what information existed in this hospital's system about the events of last night. Maddox's chart, her documentation, the ultrasound image with its 12:11 a.m. timestamp, the surgical notes from Fenwick, Dreer's complaint filing, which had its own timestamp and its own record of what he'd claimed and when he'd claimed it. All of it was in the system. All of it was evidence, depending on which way you were looking at it. She thought about Dreer being on the phone this morning, about the formal complaint, about the specific framing, unauthorized diagnostic procedure, interference with an active trauma, circumvention of chain of command. She thought about how carefully that framing avoided the central fact, which was that she had been right, that the evidence she'd generated at 12:11 a.m. had been correct, and that without it, the man in room 4 would have died on an operating table while someone fixed the wrong injury. She hadn't thought about what that meant for Dreer's record yet. Not fully. She'd been focused on the immediate problem, the suspension, the review, the patient's survival. But standing here now with the information Novak had given her and the picture of 2 men trying to access medical records in an ICU, she started to think about it in a different way. Dreer had filed a complaint within hours of the surgery, before the patient was out of the OR, before anyone knew the outcome. That was fast. Fast in a way that suggested the complaint was less about what happened and more about getting ahead of something, about establishing a narrative before the record could be examined too closely. She was still thinking about that when her phone buzzed. It was a text from a number she didn't have saved, 4 words only, check his old charts. She stared at it. Then she called the number back and got nothing. Straight to a recorded message, the automated kind that meant the line had already been disconnected. Unknown sender. Message delivered and gone. 4 words that pointed at something she hadn't considered yet. She stood in the hallway of the Callaway Ridge ICU and felt the things she'd been sensing at the edge of her awareness since last night solidify into something she could name. This was not just about one patient and one doctor and one night shift complaint. This was about something that had been building for longer than she'd been paying attention to it, in the records of this hospital, in the decisions that had been made and documented and quietly buried in a system that stored everything and surfaced nothing unless someone knew where to look. She went to the nursing station, sat down at the terminal, and pulled up the hospital records search function. She typed in Dr. Callum Dreer's name. She filtered by outcome reports, by cases flagged for review in the past 3 years, by complaints filed and then closed without action. The results loaded slowly, the way hospital databases always did, as if the system itself was reluctant. And then they were on the screen in front of her, and the number was not what she expected, and the pattern in them was not subtle once you knew to look for it. And Marin sat very still in the fluorescent quiet of the nurse's station and understood that the ultrasound image at 12:11 a.m. was not the only evidence in this building. It was just the one that finally made someone look. The number on the screen was 17 cases in 3 years where Dr. Callum Dreer had been the attending physician and the outcome had been flagged. Not by administration, not formally, but in the quieter language of the hospital system itself. Incident reports filed by nurses and then closed without escalation, quality review requests that had been submitted and then administratively resolved within 48 hours, mortality and morbidity conference notes that cited suboptimal decision sequencing in language so careful it said nothing while recording everything. 17 flags, 0 formal consequences. Marin opened the first file, then the second. She wasn't reading quickly. She was reading the way she'd been trained to read records, which was slowly enough to catch what wasn't there as much as what was. The gaps, the edits, the notes that had been amended after the fact, the timestamps that didn't quite line up, the cases where a nurse had filed an initial concern and then the concern had simply stopped existing in the system without explanation. She was on the fourth file when she heard footsteps behind her and turned. It was Dr. Elaine Fenwick, still in surgical scrubs, hair pulled back with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd been working since before dawn. She looked at the screen, looked at Marin, and pulled a chair up without asking. "You found the list," Fenwick said. Marin looked at her. "You knew it existed." "I've known about parts of it for 14 months. Fenwick's voice was flat, in the way of someone who'd made peace with something that didn't deserve peace. "I submitted a formal quality concern in February of last year. It was reviewed, resolved, and closed within 72 hours. I received a memo thanking me for my diligence and noting that the cases in question had been thoroughly examined." She paused. "They were not thoroughly examined." "Who closed it?" "Hospital administration. Specifically the chief medical officer at the time, Dr. Parrish Grunn, who retired 6 months later with a very generous severance package, and whose departure was noted in the staff newsletter as a celebration of his distinguished service." Fenwick said it without visible emotion, which was somehow the most damning version of how it could be said. "Dreer has privileges that generate significant revenue for this hospital. High-volume surgical caseload, national reputation, speaking engagements that bring in grant funding. He is, in the language of institutional healthcare, a valuable asset." "And the patients in these files?" Fenwick was quiet for a moment. "Some recovered, some didn't." She looked at the screen. "The ones who didn't? In most cases, the families were told there were complications. Which is true, as far as it goes. Complications happen. Medicine is not a guaranteed outcome. But complications and preventable errors are not the same thing, and the records in those files use the language of the first to describe the second." Marin looked at the list. 17 flags. She thought about how many cases didn't get flagged at all. The ones where a nurse didn't push back, or where the outcome was bad enough that nobody survived to raise questions, or where the institutional gravity of a man with a parking spot and a photo in the lobby simply absorbed the problem before it became visible. "The complaint he filed against me," Marin said, "is designed to be resolved before this goes any further," Fenwick said. "He's done it before. Case 8 on your list, surgical nurse named Tessa Rourke. She questioned his choice of approach on a bowel resection. He filed a complaint citing insubordination and interference. She was placed on leave, the review ran for 9 weeks, and when it concluded, she'd already taken a position at a hospital in Nevada. Fenwick paused. The patient had a second surgery 3 weeks later to repair what the first surgery missed. It's in the records if you know what to look for. Marin sat with that for a moment. Dr. Fenwick, why are you telling me this now? Fenwick looked at her directly. She had the kind of eyes that had seen a lot of things clearly and hadn't looked away from any of them. Because you're the first person in 14 months who generated documentation he can't quietly edit. That ultrasound image is time-stamped. It's in the automated system, and it went through 2 separate servers before it was stored, which means any alteration attempt creates a log entry. He knows that, which is why the complaint is framed around conduct rather than the clinical record. He can't touch the clinical record, so he's trying to make the clinical record irrelevant by making you the issue instead. Marin looked at the screen again. I need to print this, she said. You can't print from this terminal without admin authorization. I know. She picked up her phone and photographed the screen methodically. Each case, each timestamp, each closed notation. This is going to end up in federal hands, regardless of what the hospital does with it. Maddox's case triggered federal interest. And federal interest means discovery requests. And discovery requests in a case involving a government operative mean the hospital's records become subject to review that the CMO's office cannot administratively resolve in 72 hours. Fenwick was quiet for a moment. Is that what's happening here, federal involvement? It's already happening. Marin finished photographing and put her phone down. The man in room 4. Do you know who he is? I know he came in without ID and that there are federal personnel involved in his care and security. Fenwick's voice stayed even. I try not to ask questions that aren't mine to ask. That's a reasonable approach, Marin looked at her. But I need you to know something. The men in the waiting area at the end of the hall are not colleagues of his. They are not on his side. And if anything happens to his care, any change in his status, any access to his room that you haven't personally authorized, I need you to call me before you call anyone else in this hospital. Fenwick held her gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, the way people nod when they've already known something was true, and someone has finally said it out loud. I'll write a standing order that no one accesses his room without scrubbing in, she said. That gives me a clinical reason to restrict access without it looking like a security measure. Good. Fenwick stood. She looked at the screen one more time, at the 17 flags, at the closed notations, at the language of institutional self-protection arranged in neat database rows. This should have happened a long time ago, she said. It wasn't quite an apology, and it wasn't quite not one. Yes, Marin said. It should have. At 4:47 p.m., Soren Maddox's blood pressure dropped. Not catastrophically, not the cliff edge collapse of the night before, but enough that the monitor alarmed and the ICU nurse on duty, a careful young man named Dario, who Marin had assessed as competent from their first interaction, came to the door and then immediately came to find her. She was in room 4 within 90 seconds. Maddox was awake, which was something. Unconscious patients with dropping pressures were a different problem than conscious ones. He looked worse than he had 2 hours ago. She could see the tension in his face that came from pain he was controlling rather than not feeling. Tell me what you're experiencing, she said, already moving to the monitor. Pressure in the lower right quadrant. Started about 20 minutes ago. Gradual. His voice was still controlled but thinner than before. I didn't want to call unless it got worse. That was the wrong call. Any new symptoms you need to tell me about, you tell me immediately. She palpated his abdomen carefully, starting away from the surgical site and working toward it. He was rigid where he shouldn't be, not globally, but in the right lower quadrant, and there was a quality to his rigidity that told her something she didn't want to know. She looked at the drain output. The color had changed, darker than it should be at this stage of post-op recovery. She pulled out her phone and called Fenwick directly. I think he's rebleeding, she said when Fenwick picked up. Right lower quad guarding, drain output darker, pressure drop of 18 points over the last hour. I need you up here. 5 minutes, Fenwick said, and hung up. Marin turned to Dario. Get me a repeat hemoglobin right now. Bedside if we have it, stat lab if not. And push his IV rate up to 150, normal saline. She looked at Maddox. How's your pain on a scale? 6, he said. That's a lie. The corner of his mouth moved fractionally. 7. Better. She adjusted his positioning slightly, watching his face for the involuntary expressions that told more than numbers. Do you have any history of coagulation problems? Anything you haven't told the surgical team? No. A beat. There was a prior abdominal injury 3 years ago. Right side, different mechanism. She stopped. What kind of injury? Fragmentation. It was managed in a field setting and then surgically revised at a military facility about 10 days later. He held her eyes. There's scar tissue. I should have told Fenwick. Maren kept her expression professionally neutral, which took some effort. Where's the scar? Right lower quadrant. Right where his rigidity was now. The field repair, she said. What materials were used? I don't know the specifics. It was... He paused. Not a standard surgical environment. All right. She noted it in the chart with the exact language he'd used. Patient reports prior, right lower quadrant fragmentation, managed in field setting with subsequent surgical revision at military facility, details unknown to patient, possible scar tissue involvement in current presentation, because the documentation had to be exactly right, especially now, especially in this hospital. When Fenwick gets here, you tell her everything you told me. All of it. Understood. Fenwick arrived in 4 minutes, not 5. She did her own exam in silence, asked Maddock 2 direct questions, looked at the drain, looked at the hemoglobin result that Dario had just brought in, and straightened up with an expression that was very composed and very serious. His hemoglobin dropped 4 points since this morning, she said to Maren, quiet enough that it was between the two of them. That's significant for the time frame. Combined with the prior injury history and the scar tissue in the same quadrant, there may have been adhesion involvement that we missed in the initial surgery. It can happen. She said it without defensiveness, just as fact. I need to take him back in. Tonight? Within the hour if his pressure continues to trend down. Fenwick looked at the monitor. If it stabilizes in the next 30 minutes, I can wait until morning and do it with better visualization. But if it doesn't, I'll watch him, Maren said. Fenwick nodded and went to start the prep orders. Maren pulled the chair up to Maddox's bedside and sat down. Not because there was anything more to do in this immediate moment, but because sometimes staying was the intervention. You knew about the scar tissue, she said. I suspected. And you didn't say anything when they were prepping you for surgery. I wasn't in a condition to say much of anything. He looked at the ceiling, and I wasn't sure it was relevant. In abdominal surgery, prior scar tissue is always relevant. I know that now. You knew that before, she said, and it wasn't an accusation, just a statement of something she was fairly certain was true. He was too precise in his assessment of his own body for the omission to be ignorance. He was quiet for a moment. If I disclosed the prior injury, the surgical team would have wanted my full medical history, which is classified, which would have triggered a disclosure process that takes longer than you had, she said. Yes. She sat with that. The logic was operational, and she understood it, but the medical consequence of it was lying next to her in a hospital bed with a dropping hemoglobin and a possible second surgery in his immediate future. Next time you're in a hospital, she said, tell them about the prior injuries. Whatever the disclosure implications are, they're less complicated than a preventable second surgery. He looked at her. Is there usually a next time in situations like mine? Based on what I'm looking at? Yes. She said it evenly. People in your situation tend to have next times. The ones who manage it well are the ones who learn to give their medical teams enough information to work with. A pause. Then, you've done this before. Done what? Managed patients in situations like mine, outside standard clinical environments. He said it carefully, not as an accusation, more like something he was working out. The way you communicate, the way you assess the threat picture on this floor. That's not nursing school. Maren looked at the monitor. Pressure holding at 88.54. Not good, not in free fall. Let's focus on your hemoglobin. Fair enough, he said, and she could hear in his voice that he was filing the question away rather than dropping it. His pressure stabilized over the next 40 minutes. Not dramatically. It didn't bounce back to something comfortable, but it stopped trending down, which was enough for Fenwick to hold on the second surgery for the night and schedule a morning slot with imaging first thing to assess the adhesion involvement more clearly. Maren documented everything with the specificity of someone who understood that this chart was going to be read by people who were not looking at it for clinical reasons. She was back at the nurses' station at 6:30 p.m. when Novak called. The 2 men in the waiting area left, he said. About an hour ago, both of them. Together? Yes. They got into a vehicle in the parking lot and drove west. We have eyes on them. A brief pause. That's the good news. She waited. The not good news is that we've identified who sent them. There's a third party involved in this that we weren't tracking initially. A private contractor group that has been operating in the Mountain West region. They have access to resources that make the waiting room approach look like an opening move. How much time do we have before the next move? Unknown. Could be tonight, could be tomorrow. Another pause, and she could hear him choosing words. There are federal assets mobilizing, but mobilizing takes time, and time is the variable we don't control right now. Marin looked down the hall toward room 4. He may be going back into surgery in the morning. I know, Fenwick briefed me. Which means he'll be in an OR, under anesthesia, for some period tomorrow. That's the window. I know that too. Novak sounded like a man who was managing more variables than he wanted to admit. We'll have people in the building by morning, but Marin, I need you to understand that if something moves tonight, I'll handle tonight, she said. That's not, I'll handle tonight, she said again, and her voice had the specific quality it got when she wasn't negotiating. You focus on tomorrow. He was quiet for a moment. Okay. She hung up and sat for a while in the nurse's station, thinking. Bet had gone off shift. The night nurse was a competent man named Oral, who knew his floor and didn't ask questions that weren't his business, which Marin appreciated. The ICU was quiet in the particular way of a place where everything important was happening on the inside of people's bodies rather than visibly in the room. She thought about Dreyer, about the 17 files, about a nursing administrator named Gerald Oakes who'd used the phrase "the language matters" when he put her on leave, as if the name of a thing changed its shape. She pulled out her phone and looked at the photos she'd taken of the record screen. 17 cases. The pattern was consistent, not the chaotic variability of incompetence, but something more specific. Dreyer made certain kinds of decisions under certain kinds of circumstances. Specifically, he made aggressive interventional decisions in high-profile cases, the kind of cases that generated attention, that produced outcomes that looked dramatic and decisive. And he made conservative, slower decisions in cases that were complicated and less visible. The complications in those cases were attributed to the complexity of the presentation. The outcomes were documented in language that distributed responsibility across the care team. She thought about a surgical nurse named Tessa Rourke, who now worked in Nevada. She thought about the complaint she'd filed, Rourke's complaint, 9 weeks of review, then quietly resolved, then gone. Then she had a thought that made her very still. She went back to the record system and searched for Tessa Rourke's name. The HR records were a different access level. She couldn't get there. But the clinical records were in the same system, and Rourke had been a nurse, which meant her incident filings were in the nursing records database, which Marin did have access to. She found the Case 8 filing. Rourke's original incident report was there. 3 paragraphs, specific and clinical and careful in the way that nurses learned to write incident reports when they wanted them to survive review. Rourke had noted a deviation from standard surgical approach during a bowel resection, had voiced her concern intraoperatively, had been instructed by Dreyer to step back, and had documented the exchange with timestamps. Then she found the addendum, filed 3 days after the initial report. Same case number. But the authoring physician on the addendum was listed as the CMO, Dr. Parrish Grunn. The addendum reframed Rourke's documented exchange as a communication breakdown resulting from differing interpretations of intraoperative scope, and noted that the incident had been reviewed at the departmental level and found to represent a learning opportunity rather than a protocol deviation. The timestamps on the original report and the addendum were 4 days apart. The patient's second surgery, the one that corrected what the first surgery missed, was 3 weeks after the addendum. Marin sat with that for a long time. Grunn and Dreyer. Grunn, who had closed the quality concern Fenwick filed. Grunn, who had retired 6 months later with a generous severance. Grunn, who was no longer here to answer questions about case files that bore his signature. She thought about the text message she'd received. Check his old charts. Someone else knew. Someone who had seen enough to point in the right direction, from a number they'd already disconnected before she could call back. Someone inside this system who couldn't come forward openly but knew where to look. She was still thinking about who that might be when the door at the end of the hall opened. Not the elevator, the stairwell door. Aurel, the night nurse, was at the far end of the station with his back to it. Marin was facing it directly. The man who came through was not either of the men Bet had described from the waiting area. He was younger, wearing hospital scrubs, the generic blue that any surgical supply store carried, that looked right without being specifically traceable to Callaway Ridge. He had a badge clipped to his pocket. He moved like he knew exactly where he was going. Toward room 4. Marin stood up. She crossed the distance between the station and the hallway in 12 steps, which put her between the man and Maddox's door before he reached it. She didn't run, because running in an ICU at night caused alarm, and she didn't want alarm yet. She just moved with purpose and arrived first. The man stopped. He looked at her badge, then at her face. His expression was neutral in a practiced way. "I'm here to check on a patient," he said. "Room 4, ordered by Dr. Dreyer." "Dr. Dreyer doesn't have active privileges on this floor tonight," Marin said. "Room 4 is under a standing access restriction from Dr. Fenwick. If you have an authorized order, I'll need to see it in the system." He reached for the tablet clipped to his side. She watched his hands. "What's your staff ID?" she said. A flicker. Barely anything. Most people would have missed it. "It's on my badge. I need to verify it against the shift roster. Night ICU staff is a closed list." She kept her voice completely even. "What's your name?" He said a name. She didn't recognize it, which meant nothing by itself, but combined with the scrubs from a generic supplier and the stairwell entrance and the non-existent order from a physician whose patient this was not, everything together meant one thing clearly. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and they both understood what the next 10 seconds were going to determine. "Aurel," she called, without raising her voice beyond what carried the length of a hospital corridor. "I need you to verify a staff ID for me, right now." She heard Aurel's chair push back. The man in the scrubs looked at the door to room 4. He looked at Marin. He made a calculation. Then he turned and walked back toward the stairwell at a pace just below a run, and Marin was already dialing Novak before the door closed behind him, and from room 4 she heard Maddox's voice through the door, alert and quiet. "Briggs?" "I've got it," she said. "Stay where you are." The stairwell door swung shut. She got Novak on the line. "Someone just made a move," she said. "Scrubs, fake credentials, stairwell access, directly targeting room 4. He's in the building." A sharp pause. "Where is he now?" "South stairwell, going down. He had maybe a 15-second head start." "Copy that." She could hear him moving. "I'm sending people in, right now. Don't let anyone else on that floor." She turned. Aurel was standing 6 feet away, staring at her with the expression of someone who had just understood that tonight had changed into something he hadn't been briefed on. "Lock the floor," she said. "Emergency access restriction. You have the authority to do it as charge nurse on duty. Do it now, and then call security." He moved. She turned back toward room 4 and pushed the door open, and Soren Maddox was sitting up in his bed with an expression that was not quite calm. The mask had slipped slightly, just enough to show the person behind the operational composure. The person who understood exactly how exposed he was in a hospital bed, with IV lines in both arms, and a surgical repair less than 20 hours old. "How many?" he said. "At least 3 that we know of. Possibly more." She checked his monitor out of pure reflex. Pressure holding. "Federal people are coming in now. We lock this floor until they're here." "How long?" "I don't know." She looked at him directly. "Are you going to tell me now what's in your head that's worth all of this?" He looked at the locked door. He looked at the monitor. He looked at her. "Names," he said. 47 of them. Contractor network running operations in 5 states. Payments, identities, embedded personnel. He paused. "Some of those names are in institutions. Civilian infrastructure. One of them..." He stopped. "One of them what?" He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the specific expression of someone who had just decided to tell a truth they'd been holding very carefully. "One of them is on the medical staff of this hospital," he said. The silence after that lasted maybe 4 seconds. 4 seconds where Marin stood at the foot of Soren Maddox's bed and let the statement land fully, turned it over, examined what it meant for everything she thought she understood about the last 24 hours. One of the 47 names was on the medical staff of Callaway Ridge Medical Center. "How certain are you?" she said. "Certain enough that it's on the list." He shifted slightly, and she saw the effort it cost him. The post-op rigidity, the careful management of pain that he was still performing even now. I don't have the file in front of me. I have it in my head. But the name, the location, the institutional affiliation, I've had 47 names running in my head for 11 days. I'm not misremembering. Do you know which department? Surgery. She stood very still. The complaint against you, he said, watching her face. When did Dreyer file it? Within hours of your surgery. Before or after he knew you'd found the records database. She thought about the timeline. Dreyer had filed the complaint before dawn, 4 a.m., which was before she'd ever sat down at that terminal, before she'd found the 17 flags, before Fenwick had pulled up a chair and told her about the quality concern that had been buried. Before, she said, hours before. So the complaint wasn't about covering the database, Maddox said. The complaint was the primary move. The database was something you found separately. Yes. Which means there are two things happening. The complaint is about protecting his clinical reputation. The list is about something else entirely. He held her eyes. Does his behavior fit someone who's been operating under external influence? Not just ego or incompetence, actually directed. She thought about the pattern she'd found in the 17 cases. The specific selectivity of it, aggressive intervention in high-profile cases, conservative delay in complex ones. The cases where delays had outcomes that were bad for patients and good for nobody visible. She'd read it as a pattern of ego and institutional protection. But if you overlaid a different frame, if you asked not what does this protect, but what does this serve? I don't know, she said, because she didn't, and guessing wasn't the same as knowing. But I know someone who might. She pulled out her phone and called Novak. How far out are your people? She said when he answered. 8 minutes, maybe 10. I need you to run a name through whatever system you have access to. Dreyer, Dr. Callum Dreyer, attending surgeon, Callaway Ridge Medical Center, Dunmore Falls, Wyoming. I need to know if he appears anywhere in a contractor network operating in the Mountain West region. A pause that felt like recalibration. Where's that coming from? Maddox. Silence on the line for 3 full seconds. I'll run it. Keep that floor locked. She ended the call and looked at Maddox. Do you need anything right now, medically? I'm fine. That's twice you've told me that and twice you've been wrong. I'm functional, he amended, which is different. It is. She checked the drain again. Output looked stable, darker than ideal, but not accelerating. The hemoglobin drop was concerning, but the stabilization of his pressure in the last hour was a real sign, not just a delayed slide. If we get through tonight, Fenwick takes you back in tomorrow morning and fixes the adhesion involvement properly. You'll be in better shape than you were coming in. That's a low bar. It's the bar we have. Outside the room, the floor had the particular charged quiet of a locked unit. No movement in the halls. Oral at the station running the lockdown protocol. Security somewhere below doing whatever Novak's call had redirected them to do. The stairwell at the end of the hall had been sealed from the inside. The elevator required keycard access that only 3 people on the floor currently possessed. She had done what she could do with the tools she had. She stood at the window of room 4 and looked out at the parking lot, at the high halogen poles making small circles of orange light in the Wyoming dark, and thought about a name on a list of 47 that belonged to someone who came to work in this building. Novak's people arrived in 9 minutes. 4 of them, in civilian clothes, with the kind of coordinated entry that looked casual to anyone who didn't know what coordinated entry looked like. Marin buzzed them through the floor access and watched them spread out with the efficient minimum footprint movement of people who'd done this in environments considerably less comfortable than a hospital ICU. Novak himself came in last. He looked tired in a way he hadn't at noon in the diner. Not exhausted, just carrying more than he'd been carrying 6 hours ago. He came directly to her. Dreyer's name is not on the list Maddox is carrying, he said, low enough that it didn't carry to Aurel at the station. But that doesn't mean he's clean. He might not be the name. He might just be adjacent to it. Explain. She walked him through it. The 17 flags, the pattern in the cases, the grunt addendum on Rourke's complaint, the severance, the retirement timing. She watched him listen with the specific quality of attention that people in his position developed. Not reactive, just collecting, building a picture from pieces that arrived out of sequence. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Grun, he said. He retired. He's not here. He's not here, but his signature is on those records. And if someone with his level of administrative access was operating under external direction, the modifications he made to those records weren't just protecting Dreyer. He paused. They were protecting the person on Maddox's list, because if that person's name ever came up in a malpractice investigation or a quality review, there would be a paper trail leading to how those reviews got closed. Grun was the closing mechanism. Marin looked at him. Which means the name on the list is someone whose work generated problems that needed to be quietly cleaned up. Repeatedly, over years. Novak pulled out his phone and looked at something. I need to talk to Maddox. He's stable but post-op. Keep it short. Understood. She took him to room 4. Maddox looked at Novak with an expression that was partly recognition and partly the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to display relief in operational settings. They knew each other, clearly. The kind of knowing that came from shared context rather than friendship. The name on the list, Novak said without preamble. Medical staff, surgery. I need you to say it. Maddox looked at the ceiling for a moment, not hesitating, remembering with precision. Fenwick, he said. Elaine Fenwick. The word landed in the room like something physical. Marin heard it and felt the specific, disorienting sensation of a structure she'd been relying on suddenly reporting damage. Fenwick, who'd come down to the trauma bay in the middle of the night and saved Maddox's life. Fenwick, who had told her about the 17 cases and the buried quality review. Fenwick, who had pulled up a chair and handed her the thread that led to Grun. Fenwick, who knew exactly which records existed and where to find them. She made herself think rather than react. When was the name added to the list? Maddox looked at her. 8 months ago. The affiliation was confirmed through financial records, payment routing through 3 shell structures to an account with her name on a subsidiary. He paused. The case against her is financial, not operational. She wasn't running anything. She was being paid for access. Access to what? Patient data, primarily. High-value patient data. Government contractors. Federal employees. Personnel with security clearances who came through this facility. Medical records that could be used for leverage. He said it flatly. She wasn't hurting anyone directly. She was selling information. To who? The contractor network. He looked at Novak. 14 months of payments. The last one was 6 weeks ago. Marin thought about 14 months. She thought about Fenwick telling her she'd filed a quality concern 14 months ago that had been buried. She thought about the precise timing of that. A quality concern filed 14 months ago, payments beginning 14 months ago. A woman who knew the hospital's record system better than anyone, who knew which cases raised flags and how those flags got processed, who understood exactly how the institutional machinery worked and where its blind spots were. She thought about Fenwick pulling up that chair and walking her through the 17 cases. About the specificity of what she'd shared, which details, which angles, which direction she'd pointed Marin to look. And she thought about what she'd said to Fenwick directly. Federal interest means discovery requests, and discovery requests mean the hospital's records become subject to review. She'd told Fenwick that federal discovery was coming. She'd told her before Novak's people arrived. She'd told her effectively that the records were about to become visible in a way that couldn't be administratively managed. She gave me the thread, Marin said. Not to anyone specifically, just placing it in the air where it could be examined. What? Novak said. Fenwick. She came to me at the records terminal and gave me the thread that led to Grun. She told me about the quality concern she filed, about Grun closing it, about the timing of his retirement. She looked at the wall. If I follow that thread and it becomes the story, Dreyer, Grun, administrative corruption, the nursing complaint as institutional self-protection, then the story is about the surgical department and hospital administration, not about her. Novak was very still. She redirected me, Marin said, toward a real target, one that exists, one that's genuinely corrupt. She felt the particular cold clarity of it. She pointed me at something true to keep me away from something else that was also true. Maddox looked at her. You're fast. I'm thorough, she said. There's a difference. She looked at Novak. Where's Fenwick right now? He pulled out his radio. 30 seconds later, he had an answer. She left the building 40 minutes ago. Shift ended. She's not on call tonight. She knows federal people are coming in. I told her. Marin held Novak's eyes. I told her. I know. His voice stayed even. It's not your fault. That's not what I'm thinking about. She looked at the door. What I'm thinking about is that she knows the morning surgery is scheduled. She knows Maddox needs to go back in. And if she's going to do something with the information I gave her, she has between now and the OR tomorrow morning to do it. We'll have her location within an hour. An hour is a long time, she looked at Maddox. His surgery is at 7 a.m. If Fenwick doesn't come in, who operates? Novak looked at her. She could see him running the same calculation. You need to get another surgeon cleared for this case, she said. Tonight, before 7 a.m. Someone from outside this hospital. The next 3 hours were the kind of operational grind that looked nothing like urgency from the outside. A series of phone calls, cleared personnel arriving in increments, paperwork filed under federal emergency medical protocols that Marin hadn't known existed until Novak's team started using them. She stayed on the floor. She checked Maddox's vitals every 40 minutes. She drank terrible ICU coffee and sat in the nurse's station with Aurel and watched the clock and didn't sleep. At 11:30 p.m., Novak came to her with news about Dreyer. They'd found him in his office on the surgical floor, which was unusual for 11 p.m., but not unheard of for a physician with a heavy caseload. What was unusual was what his office computer showed when federal agents with a warrant examined it. A series of record access events starting at 8 p.m. that evening, after standard work hours, reaching into patient files that weren't his cases and hadn't been his cases, using access credentials that had not been properly logged. He'd been in the system, navigating toward records that intersected with Maddox's care. Not toward Maddox's file specifically. That was locked, and he knew it. But toward the nursing records database. Toward the incident reports. Toward the exact files Myron had photographed on her phone that afternoon. He was trying to see what you'd found, Novak said, and whether it was already transmitted outside the hospital system. Was he working with Fenwick or independently? We don't know yet. He's lawyered up. Novak said it without expression. His hospital privileges have been suspended pending the federal investigation. The CMO, the current one, not Grun, signed the order 20 minutes ago. Marin thought about Gerald Oakes in his office that morning saying the language matters. She thought about Dreyer's parking spot and the photograph in the lobby. She thought about 17 flags and the specific efficiency with which each one had been neutralized. He's been doing this for a long time, she said. Looks like it. Novak paused. The current CMO is cooperating. He says he had no knowledge of Grun's interventions in the quality review process. I believe him. He was 2 levels below Grun when most of that happened. He's the one who called the board tonight. The board knows? The board of directors has been notified that a federal investigation touching hospital operations is active and that several senior medical staff are involved. They're convening an emergency session tomorrow morning. He looked at her. You're going to be asked to participate. She absorbed that. In what capacity? As a witness, as the person who generated the initial documentation and identified the pattern. He held her gaze. Your administrative leave will be formally rescinded before the session. The CMO is handling that tonight. She looked at him for a long moment. And Dreyer's complaint against me? Will be withdrawn. He's not in a position to pursue it. I don't want it withdrawn, she said. I want it reviewed and formally found without merit. There's a difference between a complaint that disappears and a complaint that gets examined and rejected on its record. She watched him take that in. The record matters. It's the only thing that will matter for the nurses who come after me in this hospital. Novak looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, something adjacent to respect, though with him it was hard to be certain. I'll make sure that's communicated to the CMO. At 1:15 a.m., they found Fenwick. She hadn't fled. That was the thing that surprised Marin when Novak told her. She'd gone home. She was at her house on the east side of Dunmore Falls, and when federal agents knocked on her door, she'd opened it in 15 seconds, which was the behavior of someone who'd been sitting on the other side waiting rather than sleeping. Novak relayed this in the nurses' station in sparse sentences. Marin listened. She didn't run, Marin said. No. Was she trying to contact anyone, the contractor network? Her phone shows 3 outgoing calls between 9 and 10 p.m., all to numbers we've been tracking. None of them answered. He paused. The network is aware that we're active. Anyone on that list who can go quiet has gone quiet. Maren thought about Fenwick sitting in her house in the dark, calling numbers that weren't answering anymore. She thought about what that particular kind of alone felt like. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the specific silence. When the structure you'd been embedded in collapses around you, and there's nothing left to call. She'd never made those kinds of calls herself, but she'd been present for the aftermath of people who had. She didn't feel sorry for Elaine Fenwick. What she felt was more complicated than that. The particular exhaustion of watching someone capable do something that wasted the capacity entirely. "What happens to Maddox's surgery?" she said. "Dr. Priya Weston is being brought in from Regional Medical in Casper. She's a vascular and trauma surgeon, board-certified, federal clearance current." Novak looked at his watch. "She'll be here by 5 a.m. I briefed her on the case. She asked for Maddox's full surgical notes and your nursing documentation from last night. She'll have everything she needs," Maren said. "I'll brief her myself when she arrives." She stood up because sitting had started to feel wrong, like a category error. She went to the window of the nurse's station and looked at the parking lot, which now had 2 federal vehicles in it that hadn't been there at noon, and a security presence at the entrance that was visible even from the 3rd floor. Dunmore Falls at 1:30 a.m. Still. A Main Street hardware store and a 1970s diner and a high school parking lot and a hospital that had been quietly eating its own for years while the right people looked elsewhere. She turned around. "The 17 cases," she said. "The patients in those files, their families." "That's going to be a separate process," Novak said. "The hospital will be required to notify. Federal oversight of the records review will ensure that doesn't get managed quietly." He held her eyes. "It's going to take time, but it won't disappear. It's taken long enough already." "Yes," he said simply. "It has." Dr. Priya Weston arrived at 4:48 a.m. In a rental car she'd apparently driven at speeds that suggested she'd taken the timeline briefing seriously. She was compact and direct, and went straight to Maddox's chart before she went to anything else, which told Maren what she needed to know about her priorities. They sat together at the nurse's station for 20 minutes, while Maren walked her through the case. The initial presentation, the fast findings, the ultrasound timestamp, the grade 4 splenic lac, the post-op hemoglobin drop, the prior abdominal injury, and the scar tissue adhesion concern, the current drain output, and vital trend. Weston listened without interrupting, which was a skill not everyone had. When Maren finished, Weston asked 3 specific questions, all clinical, all precise, and Maren answered them. "You caught a lot in a short window last night," Weston said. Not effusively, just as an assessment. "The evidence was there. It needed someone to look at it." Weston looked at her for a moment with the same kind of evaluating attention that Maren had encountered from Maddox. "Former military medical?" "Long time ago." "Not that long, based on the documentation." She turned back to the chart. "I'll want you in the OR." Maren hesitated. "I'm not scrubbed into surgical at this facility. I'm bringing my own team from regional. You'd be present as a consulting clinical observer, not as scrubbed staff. Federal authorization." Weston said it like it had already been decided, which Maren realized it probably had. "Your read on this patient's physiology is the most current in this building. I want it in the room." Maren looked at the chart, at Maddox's vitals from the last check. Holding, stable, but not comfortable. "All right," she said. The surgery took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Weston found the adhesion involvement exactly where the imaging had suggested, dealt with it with the specific unhurried precision that distinguished excellent surgeons from merely good ones, and addressed 2 small additional bleeds that the original emergency surgery had been too pressured to fully assess. Maren stood at the observation position and watched and noted and answered the 2 questions Weston directed at her during the procedure, both of which were about the patient's intraoperative presentation the night before. Maddox came out of it in better shape than he'd gone in, which was the goal and was also not guaranteed. And Maren had learned to recognize the difference between outcomes that felt good and outcomes that actually were. By the time he was back in the ICU and Weston was writing her post-op notes, it was 9:30 a.m., and the board of directors of Callaway Ridge Medical Center was convening in the administrative conference room on the 5th floor, and Gerald Oakes had come to the ICU to inform Maren, in person, with a formality that suggested he'd been coached on the language, that her administrative leave had been rescinded effective immediately, that her access and credentials were fully restored, and that the hospital's legal team had been instructed that Dr. Dreyer's complaint was to undergo formal documented review rather than administrative withdrawal. She looked at him steadily. "Thank you." He looked like he had more to say, or like there was something he thought he should add. He didn't add it. After he left, she sat in the nurse's station and felt the particular specific exhaustion of a night that had been several things at once: medical, operational, investigative, and hadn't given her a moment to be any single one of them completely. Aurel, who was finishing a double shift with the patience of a man who had long ago made peace with what hospital work asked of people, brought her coffee without being asked. It was still bad coffee. She drank it. The board session lasted 4 hours. Marin testified for 40 minutes of it, answering questions from the board chair and 2 outside counsel brought in by the hospital's liability insurer, who had become very interested in Callaway Ridge very quickly once the scope of the federal investigation became clear. She answered every question directly. She cited timestamps. She referenced the documentation in the system. She described what she'd seen, what she'd done, and why she'd done it, in the precise language of someone who had never needed to embellish anything because the record said what the record said. At one point, the board chair, a woman in her 60s named Marjorie Blunt, who had the bearing of someone used to running complicated meetings and the expression of someone who was finding this one more complicated than usual, looked at her over her reading glasses and said, "Nurse Briggs, how long have you been aware of the pattern in the incident reports you identified?" "Since yesterday afternoon," Marin said. "I found the database during the course of managing a patient safety situation. Prior to yesterday, I was not aware of the pattern." "And if you had been aware of it earlier?" Marin looked at her. "I would have filed a formal quality concern." A beat. "As Dr. Fenwick did 14 months ago," Blunt said. "Yes." Another beat, longer. "And what should have happened then?" "The concern should have been investigated and acted on," Marin said. "Not closed." Blunt looked at her for a long moment, and then looked down at her notes. And Marin understood that whatever was going to happen to Callaway Ridge's administration in the coming months was going to be extensive and expensive and thoroughly documented, which was the only version of accountability that would mean anything for the 17 cases and the people in them. She left the board session at 2 p.m. and went back to the ICU. Maddock was awake, color better than it had been since she'd first seen him. The specific improvement in skin tone that came from corrected blood volume and reduced internal bleeding, the way a person started to look like themselves again after their body had spent 24 hours deciding whether to continue. He looked at her when she came in. "How'd it go?" he said. "The board has enough to work with." She checked his vitals and wrote them in the chart. "Dreyer's privileges are suspended pending the federal investigation. Grunn's records are being pulled for review. The 17 cases are going to be examined." "And Fenwick?" "Federal custody. The contractor network is being dismantled. Those numbers she called last night, none of them answered, which means the people they belong to are either gone or being picked up by other agencies." She set down the tablet. "The information you're carrying, is it enough?" "With what your hospital records added to it, yes." He said it with the flatness of someone stating a logistical fact. "The financial trail through Grunn connects 2 of the names on the list to the hospital access program. That's documentation that wasn't there before. It fills a gap." "Then it was worth it." "It was worth it before the list," he said. "You saved my life based on evidence and judgment, not because of what I was carrying." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "That's why I did it." He was quiet for a beat. "Novak told me about your background. Army medical, combat deployments, trauma specialist." He paused. "Why Dunmore Falls?" "I wanted quiet." "And now?" She thought about the last 36 hours, about the time-stamped image at 12:11 a.m., about Tessa Rourke in Nevada and the 17 cases and the families who were going to receive calls from hospital counsel in the coming weeks, about a box in her closet she hadn't opened in 4 years. "I got what I wanted for a long time," she said. "Quiet has its value." He looked at her steadily. "But?" She checked the drain one more time. Output clear, volume minimal. Weston's repair holding. "But some things are worth making noise for," she said. She updated the chart and left the room and walked down the hall of the Callaway Ridge ICU in the early afternoon light, and she wasn't thinking about what came next. Not yet. She was thinking about the ultrasound image still sitting in the hospital's automated system with its 12:11 a.m. timestamp, irrefutable and exact, the small, precise piece of evidence that had started everything unraveling. She was almost at the elevator when her phone rang. Unknown number again. But this time, when she answered, the voice on the other end wasn't disguised or brief. It was a woman's voice, carefully measured, with the specific cadence of someone reading from a prepared statement. Ms. Briggs, my name is Investigator Dana Vrell, Office of the Inspector General, Department of Health and Human Services. We've been made aware of the situation at Callaway Ridge Medical Center. I'd like to schedule a formal interview at your earliest convenience. A pause. I'd also like to inform you that the OIG has identified a second hospital in Wyoming where a similar pattern of record modification appears to exist. The incidents there go back further than what you found at Callaway Ridge. Another pause, slightly longer. And the physician, whose name appears in connection with both facilities, is not Dr. Dreyer. Marin stopped walking. Who is it? She said. And Vrell said a name that Marin recognized, not from Callaway Ridge, not from the last 36 hours, but from 7 years ago, from a different state, from a context she had never expected to intersect with this one. And the quiet that she'd been living inside for 6 years came apart in her chest, like something that had been under pressure for a very long time. The name Vrell said was Dr. Harlan Scobie. Marin stood in the hallway of the Callaway Ridge ICU and let that name move through her like something cold finding the spaces between things. Harlan Scobie. 7 years ago. A level 1 trauma center in Billings. Not this hospital, not this town, a different life in a different configuration. She'd been finishing her transition out of the Army Medical Corps, taking a civilian nursing position while she decided what came next, working under a surgical team that included a rising attending named Harlan Scobie, who was very good at his job and very aware that he was very good at his job, and who had, on one specific night during a complicated multi-trauma case, made a decision that Marin had documented in an incident report that had subsequently been reviewed, resolved, and closed within 72 hours. She had left that hospital 4 months later, not because of the incident report. The report was already buried by then, but because the specific weight of knowing what she'd seen and knowing what had been done with the record of it had made staying in that building feel like something she couldn't keep doing. She'd come to Dunmore Falls because it was far from Billings in every sense she could measure. Ms. Briggs? Vrell's voice still on the line. I know that name, Marin said. Her voice came out even. She focused on keeping it that way. We thought you might. A pause that was carefully neutral. According to records we've accessed, you filed an incident report at Northern Peaks Medical Center in Billings 7 years ago that named Dr. Scobie in connection with a documentation discrepancy during a trauma case. That report was closed without action. You left the facility shortly after. Yes. Would you be willing to speak to us about what you documented in that report? Marin looked at the elevator doors at the end of the hall. She looked at the scuff marks on the linoleum floor, the institutional overhead lights, the nurse's station where Orell was finishing his double shift with quiet, patient competence. She looked at all of it and thought about 7 years of choosing quiet, and about what quiet cost when it was the wrong choice. Yes, she said. I'll speak to you. We can come to you. We understand you're currently... I know where I am. She pressed the elevator button. I'll call you back in an hour. I need to do something first. She ended the call and rode the elevator down to the first floor and walked through the main corridor of Callaway Ridge Medical Center and out into the Wyoming afternoon, where the light was low and pale, and the air had the specific dry clarity of high altitude in early fall. She stood in the parking lot next to her truck and breathed for a moment. Just that, just breathing and letting the pieces settle into a shape she could look at straight. Harlan Scobie. 7 years. 2 states. 2 hospitals. And the same pattern. Because it was always the same pattern when it was systematic rather than incidental. Not a person making bad decisions under pressure. A person making calculated decisions across time in different locations with institutional machinery that had been arranged to absorb the consequences. Grun at Callaway Ridge, someone else at Northern Peaks, 7 years ago. She didn't know who had closed her report in Billings, had never known, had left before she could find out. But someone had. And Scobie had moved on, and she had moved on, and the pattern had continued because that was what patterns did when nobody connected them across time and geography. The OIG had connected them. She got into her truck and called Novak. "Did you know about Scobie?" she said when he answered. A pause that answered the question before he did. "We knew his name was in the network. We didn't know you had prior contact until about 20 minutes ago when Vrel's office called me." "He's connected to Fenwick's network?" "Peripherally. He's not one of the 47 names Maddock is carrying, but the financial routing that connected Fenwick to the contractor group passed through an intermediary that also connects to Scobie's name on a separate series of transactions." He paused. "This is bigger than Callaway Ridge. I want you to understand that. What you walked into the night Maddock came through those doors was the visible surface of something that's been operating across multiple facilities for the better part of a decade." "How many hospitals?" "We're currently looking at 4, possibly 5. Marin thought about that. 4 hospitals. The specific human scale of what that meant, not as an abstraction, but as individual patients, individual nights, individual nurses who filed reports that were closed and then left for Nevada or Dunmore Falls or wherever the weight of knowing became more manageable than staying. "I'll talk to Vrel," she said. "I know. I think you should." He paused, and she heard in the pause something that wasn't quite professional, a register slightly below the operational tone he'd maintained for the last 36 hours. "Marin, what you did 2 nights ago, and then everything after, the record you built, the documentation, the way you held this floor last night. That's the thing that made this prosecutable, not just for Maddox's case, for all of it. The OIG had pieces, but they needed an anchor inside an active facility with time-stamped primary evidence to get the federal warrants moving fast enough to prevent the network from going fully dark. She absorbed that without responding to it directly, because responding to it felt like a different kind of conversation than the one she was equipped for right now. Will Maddock be able to move today? Tonight, he's stable enough per Weston's assessment. We're transferring him to a federal medical facility in Denver. Tell him I said he should actually sleep this time. A brief sound that might have been Novak almost smiling. I will. She drove home. The box in the closet was where it had always been. On the shelf above the hanging clothes, brown cardboard, sealed with tape that had dried and cracked at the edges over 4 moves in 6 years. She pulled it down and set it on the bed and looked at it for a moment before she opened it. Inside, her Army Medical Officer credentials, framed certificate from the combat trauma training program she'd completed in her 3rd year of service, a photograph of her unit taken somewhere in a forward operating base that she could identify by the light and the specific quality of dust in the air without needing to read the location from the back. A folder of incident documentation from Northern Peaks, her copy, the one she'd kept because something had told her to, though she hadn't known what for. Her discharge paperwork, a citation she'd never displayed. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the Northern Peaks folder. Her own handwriting, 7 years ago. Precise, clinical, the specific language of someone trained to document in ways that survive scrutiny. The incident she'd recorded was a decision Scobie had made during a multi-trauma case, a sequencing error in surgical priority that had resulted in a delayed intervention and a patient outcome that had been documented as a complication of the initial trauma rather than a consequence of the sequencing. She'd noted the timeline discrepancy. She'd noted the specific decision point. She'd named it plainly. The administrative resolution stamped across the bottom of her copy read, "Reviewed and closed. No protocol deviation identified. Staff counseled on appropriate scope of incident reporting." Staff counseled. She remembered that meeting. 15 minutes in an office smaller than Oaks's, with a nursing director who hadn't made eye contact and a human resources representative who'd taken notes without looking up. The message had been delivered without being stated directly. The way these messages always were. The way the language was always carefully managed, so the message was clear and the record was clean. She put the folder down and looked at the photograph. She thought about Tessa Rourke in Nevada. She thought about whatever nurses were at Northern Peaks right now, working under a system that had been smoothing over Scobie's record for years, going home and carrying the weight of things they'd seen and couldn't prove and didn't know how to fight. She reached for her phone and called Vrel back. The OIG interview happened the next morning. Not in Dunmore Falls, but by secure video, Marin at her kitchen table, with the Northern Peaks folder open in front of her and Investigator Vrel on the screen, with a colleague who was introduced and then mostly listened. It lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Marin described the Billings case in the same precise clinical language she'd used 7 years ago, now amplified by 7 years of knowing how to read the institutional patterns around it. She provided her documentation. She answered follow-up questions without embellishment or speculation, staying in the lane of what she'd directly observed and recorded. When it was done, Vrel said, "Your report from 7 years ago, combined with what you documented at Callaway Ridge, gives us linkage across 2 facilities and 2 time frames. That's the evidentiary bridge the federal case needed." A pause. "I want to be clear that the investigation into Dr. Scobie is separate from the Callaway Ridge case and will proceed on its own timeline, but your testimony is material to both." "When does it become public?" Marin asked. "The Callaway Ridge components will become public through the board proceedings and the federal court filings, which will be unsealed progressively as the case moves forward. The Scobie investigation," Vrel paused. "Within 30 days, we expect. The warrants are moving. The other hospitals, the other facilities you mentioned. We're in contact with the relevant nursing and medical staff at each location. We're also reviewing historical incident reports across the network." Vrel looked at her directly. "We've already identified 3 other nurses at different facilities who filed reports that were administratively closed in a pattern consistent with what you experienced. We're reaching out to each of them." Marin thought about that for a moment. 3 other people carrying 7, 8, 10 years of documented truth that had been processed out of the system. Carrying it alone, because that was how it worked. Because the institutional response to a closed report was to make the person who filed it feel like the problem rather than the solution. "Make sure they know their reports mattered," she said. "Even the closed ones. Make sure they know someone looked." Vrel held her eyes on screen. "We will." The formal board hearing at Callaway Ridge happened 9 days later. It was not a small event. The hospital's legal team, 2 OIG representatives, a state medical board examiner, outside counsel for the insurer, and 8 board members seated around a table in the 5th-floor conference room that normally hosted budget meetings and strategic planning sessions and had never hosted anything like this. Marin sat at one end of the table in the chair that had been designated for her, with a folder she didn't need because she knew the record well enough to speak from it directly. Dr. Callum Dreyer was not present. He had retained criminal defense counsel and was not participating in the board proceeding on the advice of that counsel, which told everyone in the room what his criminal defense counsel thought was coming. His hospital privileges had been suspended for 11 days. His surgical cases had been redistributed. His parking spot was empty. The photograph of him in the lobby had been quietly removed 3 days after the federal investigation became active. Not announced, not replaced, just gone one morning, leaving a slightly less faded rectangle on the wall where it had been. The board proceeding covered 4 hours of documentation review, testimony, and formal findings. Marin spoke twice, once to present the timeline of the night Maddock arrived, and once to present the pattern she'd identified in the incident report database. She spoke without anger, without theater, in the measured language of someone who trusted the record to carry the weight, so her voice didn't have to. When the board chair, Marjorie Blunt, read the formal findings into the record, she read them carefully and completely. That Dr. Dreyer's conduct in the management of the patient presented on the night in question represented a deviation from standard of care. That Nurse Briggs's clinical assessment and subsequent actions had been appropriate and necessary. That the administrative complaint filed by Dr. Dreyer was found to be without clinical merit and had been filed in a manner inconsistent with the hospital's ethics policies. That the historical pattern of incident report closure identified in the review represented a systemic failure of the hospital's quality assurance process, and that the hospital was formally committed to a remediation process under OIG oversight. Then she looked up from the paper. "Nurse Briggs," she said, "on behalf of this board, I want to state clearly and for the record that your conduct on the night of the incident and in the days that followed reflected the highest standard of patient advocacy. The hospital failed to support that advocacy appropriately, and that failure is one that this institution takes seriously and intends to address structurally." She paused. "You had every justification to simply document your concerns and step back. You chose instead to keep your patient alive. That distinction matters." The room was quiet. Marin looked at Blunt. Thank you, she said. And then, because she was not a person who left important things unsaid when the record was open, I want to note that Dr. Fenwick also identified the systemic problem 14 months ago and filed a formal concern that was suppressed. Whatever her subsequent choices were, that initial act of documentation was correct and should be part of this record. Blunt looked at her for a moment. It is noted, she said. The weeks after that had the specific texture of aftermath, not clean resolution, because nothing real resolves cleanly, but the gradual shift of weight when a structure that's been holding too much finally gets redistributed properly. Dr. Dreyer was formally charged by the U.S. Attorney's Office with obstruction of a federal investigation and falsification of medical records, charges that carried serious consequences and that his criminal defense attorney was apparently spending considerable time working against. The state medical board opened a parallel proceeding. Neither process was going to be quick or simple, because they never were, but they were open and on record and not going to be closed in 72 hours by someone with a parking spot and a lobby photograph. Dr. Elaine Fenwick entered a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors. The information she provided about the contractor network's hospital access program contributed to charges against 11 individuals across 4 states, including 2 people connected to the men who had appeared in the Callaway Ridge ICU waiting room on the morning after Maddock arrived. She faced federal charges of her own: wire fraud, unauthorized disclosure of protected health information, conspiracy, and the cooperation agreement would affect the sentencing range but not the underlying conviction. She was no longer practicing medicine. The surgical floor she'd run for 6 years was being managed by a locum team, while the hospital conducted a full review of cases under her oversight. Dr. Harlan Scobie was arrested at Northern Peaks Medical Center in Billings on a Wednesday morning, 31 days after Vrel had said his name on the phone in the Callaway Ridge hallway. The arrest was not announced in advance, and it was not private. He was walked out of the hospital during morning rounds, and the people who saw it, and the story ran in the Montana and Wyoming regional press with enough detail to be understood. His attorney described the charges as contested. The OIG documentation described them as supported by records from 2 facilities across 7 years and the testimony of 4 nurses whose incident reports had been systematically closed. Marin read the news report on her phone on a Friday evening, sitting at her kitchen table with the same bad coffee and the early dark coming down outside the window. She read it twice. She thought about the photograph she'd taken of his case at the conference back in Billings, when she'd been 29 years old and still learning the difference between what the record said and what the institution would do with the record. She thought about the incident report in her folder that had been stamped closed and what it had cost her to carry it. Then she closed the news app and put her phone down and sat with the quiet for a while. Not the avoidant quiet she'd been living in for 6 years, but a different kind. The kind that comes after something has been finished rather than suppressed. Soren Matic called from a number she didn't recognize 18 days after his transfer to the federal facility in Denver. His voice was stronger than it had been in the Callaway Ridge ICU. Not all the way back, but moving in the right direction. Weston says the repair is holding, he said. She wanted me to tell you the adhesion work she did was, and I'm quoting, textbook, which is unusual given the initial conditions. Tell her I said the initial conditions were your fault for not disclosing the prior injury. A brief pause that might have been a laugh from someone who didn't quite laugh. I've been informed of that, multiple times. Good. She looked out the kitchen window. The spruce tree had gone fully into fall color, the needles turning at the tips in the way that spruce did, subtle and slow. How are you actually doing? Functional, he said. And then, because she'd called him on that word before, better than functional, still not good, but moving toward it. A pause. The information I was carrying, the 47 names, the financial routing, the institutional connections, the case is moving. It's going to be a long process. Federal cases usually are. Yes. A beat. Novak told me about Scobie, about Billings. I figured he might. You carried that for 7 years. I carried the documentation, she said. There's a difference between carrying evidence and carrying a weight. I tried to make it the first thing. Did that work? She thought about it honestly. Mostly. Not entirely. She looked at the kitchen table, at the empty spot where the Northern Peaks folder had sat for 9 days before she'd sent it to Vrel's office. But it worked enough to still be here when it mattered. He was quiet for a moment. I asked about your background because I wanted to understand how someone ends up in Dunmore Falls with that level of capability and that level of willingness to be invisible. And? I think I understand now. Another beat. You weren't hiding. You were waiting for something worth moving for. She didn't answer that immediately, because it was close enough to true that it deserved more than a quick response, and not quite true enough that she could just agree. I think I was tired, she said finally. I think after Billings I needed to be somewhere that asked less of me, and then I was there long enough that it became the plan instead of the pause. And now? She thought about the board hearing, about Marjorie Blunt reading findings into the record in a room that smelled like stale conference air and institutional carpet, about the 3 nurses Vrell had mentioned at other facilities who were being contacted about reports they'd filed that had been closed, about Dr. Falk, the second-year resident who had photographed an ultrasound screen at 12:11 a.m. because a nurse had asked her to and she'd decided that mattered. Now I'm still in Dunmore Falls, she said, doing the same job, but I'm doing it differently. How? I'm doing it out loud. The hospital offered her a formal role, patient safety officer, a newly created position with actual authority, rather than the advisory-only structure such positions typically carried. The CMO, whose name was Dr. Ferris Obi, and who had turned out to be someone who had been waiting for the institutional permission to do things correctly, presented it to her in his office on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after the board hearing. The position would have direct reporting to the board's Quality Oversight Committee, he said, not through medical administration. The structural separation is intentional. She looked at the offer letter. I have conditions. I expected that. He said it without irony. Incident reports filed by nursing staff are reviewed by this office before they go to any administrative layer. No complaint against a nurse for a report filed in good faith can proceed without my sign-off. Any report that's closed without action gets a mandatory secondary review within 30 days. Agreed. And I keep my floor shifts. She held his eyes. 3 nights a week. I'm not leaving patient care to sit in an office. This job works because I'm in the building, not because I'm reviewing documents from a separate floor. He looked at her for a moment. That's unusual for this kind of position. Yes, she said. He thought about it for about 4 seconds. Agreed. She signed the letter. On the morning she walked back into Callaway Ridge in her official new capacity, which looked, from the outside, like any other morning, because she'd never been someone who needed an entrance to feel like she'd arrived, she went to the ICU first. Habit. She checked in with the night charge nurse, looked at the census board, noted the 3 patients who were post-surgical, and asked 2 specific questions about their overnight courses that she would have asked on any shift. Then she walked to the records terminal and logged in with credentials that now carried a different level of access, and she pulled up the incident report queue. There were 4 pending reports filed in the last 2 weeks. 2 from nursing staff, 1 from a respiratory therapist, 1 from a resident, Dr. Falk, the second notation from her in as many weeks. Marin opened each one. She read them carefully, the way she'd been reading records for a long time. Slowly enough to catch what wasn't there as well as what was. She documented her initial assessment on each. She flagged 2 for immediate follow-up and scheduled a meeting with the filing staff for the following day. None of these reports were going to be stamped closed in 72 hours. None of the people who filed them were going to sit in a small office and be counseled on the appropriate scope of incident reporting. That was not a guarantee she could make about every hospital in this country, or about every system shaped the way this system was shaped, or about the 10,000 ways that institutions found to absorb the concerns of the people doing the actual work and convert them into something that didn't threaten the structure. She knew what she was able to change and what she wasn't. She had always been realistic about the limits of what one person could do, which was part of how she'd stayed effective for as long as she had. Not by believing she could fix everything, but by being very precise about what she could actually reach. She could reach this hospital, these reports, these nurses. That was enough to work with. She finished the reviews, saved the documentation, and logged out. She walked down the hall and took the stairs to the ground floor and came out into the main corridor where the wall still showed the lighter rectangle where Dreyer's photograph had been, and someone had placed a small framed print there in the interim. A landscape, generic, the kind of thing facilities purchasing ordered in bulk. She looked at it briefly and moved on. The morning shift was starting, the particular organized motion of a hospital changing between one group of people and the next, the handoffs and the briefings, and the specific quality of fatigue in the faces of people finishing 12 hours against the alertness of the people beginning it. She'd been on both sides of that exchange more times than she could count. She knew what it cost and what it meant and what it produced in the people who kept showing up to do it. She knew what it felt like to show up and do the right thing and have the institution turn the thing you'd done into evidence against you. She knew what it felt like to carry that in a box in a closet and move it 4 times without opening it. She also knew what it felt like to open it. There was a nurse at the station near the ER bay, young, maybe her second year, with the specific expression of someone learning how much the job asked, while still believing in why they'd chosen it. She was on the phone, trying to reach a physician for a patient update, and the physician was not picking up, and the patient update was time-sensitive, and the nurse's face showed the specific tightening of someone who knew what the right thing to do was and wasn't yet sure she had the standing to do it. Maren stopped. The nurse looked up and saw her badge, the new one, different lanyard, different designation, and something in her expression shifted. "You need backup?" Maren said. The nurse hesitated for 1 second. "He's not picking up, and the patient's pressure is dropping." "Then we escalate," Maren said simply. "Right now, together." She moved to the station. "Show me the chart." The nurse showed her. They handled it. It wasn't dramatic. It was 2 people making the right calls in the right order with the right documentation, which was what the job was when the job was done correctly. The physician was reached. The patient's care was adjusted. The chart reflected what had happened and why, and who had been involved and when. Afterward, the young nurse looked at her and said, "Is it always going to feel like that? Like you have to fight just to do the thing you're supposed to do?" Maren thought about how to answer that honestly. "Sometimes," she said. "Less often, in a hospital that takes this seriously, but sometimes yes." She held the nurse's eyes. "The thing is, that feeling, that friction you just pushed through, that's not a sign you did something wrong. It's a sign you did something right when it would have been easier not to." She paused. "The people who last in this work are the ones who figure out the difference between the friction that means stop and the friction that means keep going. What you just did? That was keep going." The nurse looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, the specific nod of someone absorbing something they plan to carry with them. Maren went back to her work. Outside, the Wyoming morning was doing what Wyoming mornings did in the fall, cold and clear and indifferent to everything happening inside the buildings under its light. The way weather was indifferent to human scale, and that indifference was somehow clarifying rather than diminishing. The world was large and the problems in it were specific, and the specific ones were the only ones any person could actually do anything about. She had spent 6 years believing that choosing quiet was the same as choosing peace. She understood now that they were not the same thing. Peace was something you built, actively, out of decisions made in real time with real stakes. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of integrity inside it. Quiet was just quiet. It kept nothing safe. It changed nothing. It was just the sound of what hadn't happened yet. What had happened in this hospital, in this town, across the span of one night that became 30 days that would become years of proceedings and remediation and slow, imperfect institutional change. None of it was finished. None of it was clean. The people who had been harmed were still harmed. The families who would receive calls from hospital counsel were going to receive those calls into lives that had already been shaped by loss. The nurses who had filed reports in other facilities were still carrying whatever they'd carried, and the calls from Vrel's office were going to help, but help wasn't the same as repair. She knew that. She had always known that, from the first time she'd worked in an environment where the stakes of being wrong were immediate and human and irreversible. She'd never been someone who confused doing what she could with fixing what she couldn't. But in the ICU on the 3rd floor of this building, there was an ultrasound image in the automated system with a timestamp of 12:11 a.m. that had never been edited and could not be, because the system that stored it logged every access and every change, and the record was what it was, permanent and specific and true. A nurse had run an ultrasound. She had seen free fluid in a space where free fluid meant a man was bleeding to death from the wrong direction. She had said so, clearly, in a room full of people who told her to step back. She had said so again. She had escalated. She had done it with the knowledge that doing it would cost her something, and she had done it anyway, because the cost of not doing it was a man's life, and that was a calculation she had made in about 10 seconds and had not revisited since. The record said that. It said it clearly and permanently, and in language that no parking spot and no lobby photograph could overwrite. She had not saved him because she was exceptional. She had saved him because she showed up, paid attention, and refused to let the size of the room convince her that what she saw was wrong. That was not a gift that belonged to people with military backgrounds or classified histories or sealed boxes in closets. It was a capacity that lived in every person who had ever stood at a bedside and chosen the patient over the path of least resistance. She had just been, that night, the one who was standing in the right place. And the right place, she had finally understood, was not somewhere you found by leaving everything difficult behind and moving to a quiet town in Wyoming and waiting for the world to ask less of you. The right place was wherever you had the skill to do something that mattered and the will to do it when it cost you something real. She had been in the right place all along. She just hadn't been willing to stand in it fully until now.